Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our first webinar of 2023. So a very happy new year for everyone who's joined us today from all around the world. Thank you so much for giving us your time, and hopefully we'll be having a really intriguing, interesting, and exciting discussion as we go along over the next 45 to 60 minutes. So as you can see, the topic of today's discussion / debate is going to be service mesh versus API gateways, or service mesh versus API management. What you should know for your API first business. It's a topic that has plagued the industry almost at this point in a lot of different ways, and it's been a confusing space for some. So we've been doing a bit of research ourselves. We've been diving into the world of API gateways, obviously being core part of our business, diving into the world of service mesh. We have our opinions, we have our thoughts. We're going to be exploring all of that as we go along over the course of today's session. Before we move on, I am Budha, product evangelist here at Tyke, and I'll be hosting today's session. With me today are two esteemed guests who are going to be enlightening us with their thoughts, opinions, and experiences in this particular space. So here we have Sedky Abou-Shamalah and Ahmet. So Sedky, first, tell us a little bit about yourself and say hi to our
hi
audience.
everybody. Yeah, thank you so guys so much for tuning in. I'm looking forward to your hard-hitting questions. Try to puzzle us if you can, or if you have any insights to share, that's great. You know, we'd love to share it with everybody else. My background is a developer. I was a developer for many years, full stack dev, from building APIs and front ends and to consume them, and all sorts of stuff across many different languages, and then went into DevOps. Now more of a consultant these days. I help companies evaluate API management platforms, notably, of course, Tyke. So we'll be a little bit biased there, but I've had a wonderful time talking to hundreds of companies and users over the past couple of years about their requirements and what they're looking for from APIs and API management. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of that insight with you today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like just saying product evangelist on my end is a little bit of a soft start, but thank you so much for that, for that introduction. I'm almost assuming everybody already knows us, but anyway, over to you, Ahmet, perhaps a little bit of introduction of yourself.
Yep. Hi there, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Ahmet. I've worked at Tyke for just over 5 years now. Started out as a consulting engineer, helping our customers get on board, understanding how we can help them in the space of API gateways and API management. And then I moved into more on the product side. So I head up Tyke's R&D function within the business. So looking forward to the horizon at what the future of our offering might be. So that's me. And yeah, looking forward to give some insights and also learn a bit more too. So.
Thank you so much, Ahmet. Ahmet also is a head of research here at Tyke as well, almost looking at a way forward into the world, in the landscape of technology, how things are evolving and how we perhaps can look at those technologies and putting it in the context of problems that they solve. So we'll probably try and achieve some of that as well here with this discussion with service mesh and API management. Once again, these are tools, and we want to see how those tools are solving different challenges. So before we begin, I thought we'll sort of ground the discussion in a couple of things. We'll probably make a couple of assumptions as we go along. The assumption here is that we are talking about a landscape, a world where both monoliths and microservice architectures exist already. Whether microservices should work or whether you should be using that or not is a debate for another day. We've got our own thoughts and opinions on this, and you can probably find this online already, but that's probably for another day. But for today's discussion, we will be assuming that you are already familiar with microservices, monoliths. We're not going to recap that. We'll also be assuming that you already are familiar with the world of APIs and what they are and the different styles of APIs, perhaps. Also, what I wanted to do is to start off with certain statements, things that we've been made to believe over the past few years, things that have led to certain confusions, led to certain clarities, but equally, they've also had this issue of, okay, what is right? What is right for my business? And a lot of that context comes out of these sort of discussions coming out of it. So you've been made to believe certain things. And once again, I'm not going to make a judgment of whether this is right or wrong yet. That is part of our discussion today. I'm just going to throw those statements out. I'm not saying whether they are right, whether they are wrong, or in between somewhere. Starting off with the very first one is that service mesh and API management, or service mesh and API gateways, are the same thing. I'm really trying to bite my tongue here and not say anything at this point, but this is a statement I've seen fairly commonly that, you've got service mesh that is essentially going to double up as your API management system as well. So the second one is that your business will not succeed in today's landscape without either an API gateway or a service mesh or both. If you don't have one of these two, or if you don't have both of them, then you're likely going to fail. And, once again, these are bold statements when people tend to make this, once again, out of context, may or may not work very well. So we'll discuss again, we'll look into some of this. And I can see Sedky is already itching to give me an answer on this one. On to the next one, you can only have one. So we started off with having, you need to have one, absolutely. And then there are statements that say you can only have one because, one will do the job. And that leads me on to the final one, which is one solution should be able to do both of them. One solution to rule them all, one tool to rule them all. Your entire stack can be dependent on that one single thing that does both things that the service mesh is meant to do, things that an API gateway is meant to do. Your overall API management is taken care of with one single thing across networks, across layers, and across systems. I feel like I might have given myself away with that little rant towards the end. But anyway, these are the 4 statements that we're going to be sort of grounding our discussion on today. And hopefully these are questions that you've come across as well. And if not, at any point of time, do feel free to use our chat or Q&A section to post your questions, and we will pick that up towards the end or perhaps during the discussion if it is pertinent to the topic that we are discussing at that point of time. So don't feel bound by what you're hearing. This is not a broadcast. This is a conversation, and we would love to know and hear from you what you have felt, experienced, want to learn, struggled with at any point. If you've got difference of opinions, absolutely flag them out. We are more than open to discussing them. We could be wrong as well. So, we are open to that possibility. Hopefully we are not very, very wrong, but, we are open to that possibility. So before we move on, once again, the challenge sometimes has been around definitions, defining things in this particular landscape, especially with so many terminologies, definitions that are floating around, and it seems like people tend to have different views on different things. Some would say that should not be the case because, things should have more defined definitions. But once again, it comes down to context and environments and what you're using it for. So things may change. So I'm going to try to give you a very, an oversimplified version of the definition of what a service mesh is and what an API gateway is, and then we'll open up the discussion with our panelists today and see if they agree with this, disagree with this, or want to extend this in some way. So first of all, I want to talk about what is service mesh. And maybe you're already familiar with this. Maybe you've seen this definition. Maybe you smirk or sigh at this definition. But this is a definition that I'm going to go for in an oversimplified manner. A service mesh is a dedicated infrastructure layer for making service-to-service communication safe, fast, and reliable. I'm going to go over that one more time. The service mesh is a dedicated infrastructure layer for making service-to-service communication safe, fast, and reliable. So this is the original definition when the creators of service mesh came together. This is what they intended service mesh to be. Most of it is still true. However, certain things have been a little bit more muddled than what they should have been. Once again, comes down to the context that you're using this in. So this is what I'm going to go for in terms of my definition for what is a service mesh. Moving on, we've got what is an API gateway. So an API gateway is an API management tool that sits between a client and a collection of backend services, acting as a reverse proxy. That was originally, when we thought about API gateways, they're meant to be reverse proxies, and they were supposed to sit in front of your APIs and do certain things. And those things were to enable safe, fast, and reliable access to your APIs and API products. Now, if you're thinking that there is a repetition of terms when we talk about service mesh and API gateways, that is not a mistake. That is actually true. And that's where some of those similarities sort of come in, where they're both looking to do similar things. However, there are subtle differences in terms of where and what point they are actually coming into existence and what their overall objective is while trying to make safe, fast, and reliable access to your services or your APIs. So that's the definition I'm going to go for. You may agree, you may disagree with this, but I thought I'll set the context here and perhaps open up the floor now with our panelists after I stop sharing this. and see what their thoughts are on these definitions and some of those claims that we've seen before. So Sedky, perhaps we'll start off with you.
Yeah, no, I'll start, and it's brief because I completely agree with the way you put it. I write about service mesh and API management a lot just because I've seen people who are interested in one solution or the other, frankly, get them very confused with each other, as you know, which is why we're here debating this, to explain the differences. So I do agree with the definition that you laid out. In a nutshell, the service mesh is more concerned about services as a whole, which version of the service is running, how healthy are they, which service can communicate with which service, are they secured, and all this kind of stuff. Whereas API gateways and API management are concerned with the APIs themselves. So within your service, what are the endpoints? How healthy are those endpoints? And so on and so forth. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm excited to break it down a little bit more, but curious to see if Ahmet has a separate opinion.
No, I can't disagree with the statements about what they are. I guess the service mesh isn't really solving any new problems. Okay, there's like it's not solving any new problems. It's just the context is slightly different. So from my perspective, there are big overlaps in capabilities, but they were designed for different things. So we're just changing the context. And imagine the days of old, everything was rather static. You would deploy your services, whether they be monolithic, and you would then maybe put them behind a load balancer and you would configure things and they would largely stay there. And now we've moved to the cloud and we've started thinking about microservices. We've started thinking about elastic compute, and we need to be able to scale things up and scale things down. And we need to be able to do things in a consistent manner. So service mesh just does that consistently across microservices. And sorry, bear with me for a moment. So service mesh just does that same thing consistently across microservices, whereas API gateways would have been, I suppose, more designed for allowing traffic into and out of your systems, or into and out of your infrastructure.
Great opening statements made there. Perhaps I think you started sort of looking into some of those similarities, differences as well. Sedky, over to you. In terms of, obviously, we've spoken a little bit about, thinking about the similarities. Obviously, there's differences that we'll also go into. But when people think about it, what is the most confusing part here, where you see a lot of things that are similar? So what, if you can sort of elucidate some of those similarities as we go on, what are the commonalities between them? And then perhaps we'll take a stab at the differences after.
Sure, absolutely. So the reason that they're confused, quite frankly, is because they have very there's an overlap between their feature set. So rate limiting, you can do so Istio is the de facto service mesh, right? If you look at in terms of usage, I can't remember the last statistic, but it was an overwhelming majority of people who are looking at service meshes or using a service mesh use Istio. And so we'll refer to them here so if you look at an Istio, it's going to offer rate limiting. It's going to offer authentication to some degree. It's going to offer round robin load balancing to some degree. It's a long list. Whereas if you look at an API gateway, so of course, take Tyke as an example, authentication is a bare bones 101. Here's what I need my API gateway to do. Rate limiting, of course, another very obvious feature set. So this is why they're often looked at, although Ahmet already explained that they solve those two in different capacities. So when you are looking at API gateway, it's because you want to expose an API normally not only for DDoS protection, but more so it's for business. It's a business goal. So the reason to expose an API is, imagine so if you're an API company, it's obvious, in order to generate revenue, you need to expose APIs. And you need to sell them as packages, 10 requests a minute, 1,000 requests a minute. But every other company, you might want to expose APIs in order to allow people to build on top of them, to expose them to a partner. And so this is where an API gateway comes in, is you want to expose them for those purposes. Whereas a service mesh isn't traditionally used to expose APIs via, say, a developer portal. It's more about making sure that your APIs are protected. It's less about API products and more about security. And so I guess to wrap up my answer by also answering the first question a little bit more, the people who are interested in the solutions are quite different. So if I'm looking at a service mesh, I am a DevOps person who is charged with watching my API ecosystem to see the health of all the services. I am an infrastructure person who wants to make sure that MTLS is automatically pushed out to all my services. So it's a different persona versus API management, where I might be a CTO who wants to re-enable discoverability, or excuse me, increase discoverability of APIs internally, or a CRO who wants to open up an extra revenue stream by publishing API products to a developer portal where they can be consumed. So although the feature set looks very similar, the people who are interested in the outcomes of the two systems are usually very different.
Yeah, and I think similarities, if we really just sort of put them in terms of categories, we look at it from the perspective of traffic management as being one of the key things. And once again, it comes down to the context in which you are actually viewing that traffic management and transformation potentially, whether you're looking at observability and at what point of what level of your architecture or solution you're looking at that as well. And the same thing goes with security as well. And security, at what point, at what level are you looking at it is the important part. You mentioned there again that when we talk about service mesh, we are talking more from a service to service level communication, and the people who might be interested in this might be a little bit different, and their objectives and goals might be a little bit different, as opposed to, say, doing that at an API gateway level or API management level, where it'll be a little bit higher up, and the people who are concerned with what the outcomes are by adopting an API gateway probably a little bit different from what you're looking at with service mesh. Curious to get your thoughts there, Ahmed, in terms of similarities, differences. You probably touched upon that a little bit already, but from just having those on two different levels, how do people think about these things differently? Because there is that because seeing common feature sets automatically rings a bell. Like, can't I just use the same thing there, as opposed to having two different things and solutions in my stack?
I guess for me, when you have a service mesh, you're saying I've got these microservices which are built in different technologies: Node.js, PHP, Java, C#. I've also got my databases, and I've got other messaging queues and other things like that deployed within my infrastructure. And then I need to go and apply security. It's about connectivity between those different services and microservices. Whereas when you're talking about API management and API gateways, you're actually talking about, how can I put this? Maybe you need to do some transformations. Okay, you need to, on a per API basis. So it's more about the actual API. You're saying, oh, I want to take this legacy SOAP service and I want to expose it as GraphQL so that I can offer a better user experience for my API consumers. So you're doing, you're performing different things across each of the across each of the APIs, because you have some kind of business outcome, as Sedky was kind of alluding to before. I'm productizing my service by exposing an API for it, and I want to manage that API, and I want to manage the versioning of those APIs and things like that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do consistently across a service mesh, because they're solving different problems for different use cases.
One term that comes up, I think, based on that discussion, one term sort of comes up every time we talk about it, is east-west versus north-south. So I want to perhaps shed a little bit light on that. Maybe Sedky, tell us a little bit about what that means in the context of service mesh and API gateways.
Right. So because of the complexity introduced with the two different concepts, I'll say the industry as a whole found an easy way to explain them, which is to say that generally speaking, an API gateway handles north-south traffic. So is traffic from the outside world into your API ecosystem. Let's pretend that's AWS or something. It's a front door. It's a bouncer. So the north-south is going through the API gateway, through the bouncer into the wide world of your APIs. And then once you're in there, the service mesh again, generally speaking, is designed to solve east-west. So once I'm inside the club, if I may, or inside the API ecosystem, how do I know I'm allowed to speak to whatever other APIs exist? And this was the service mesh was largely born as a solution to very large-scale problems.
Yes, absolutely right there with East, West, and North, South. And I think that's the interesting bit there too, where when we talk about efficiency here, and I think efficiency of solution, the idea there was within the service communication, what you need specific to that level of application or that level of communication, the kind of security that you need, the kind of observability you need, the kind of monitoring that you need, or the traffic management that you need at that level within that environment is going to be a little bit different from what you would need at a higher level, at that north-south level, where you're looking to expose your APIs for consumption externally. And that externally might be within your organization still to build out products, or it could be externally when you're productizing your APIs, but the kind of security, again, that you need, the kind of KPIs or the kind of outcomes that you need from it is going to be quite different. And therefore, the idea behind having each one of them was to have an efficient solution that would address each of those problems at those two different layers. However, that has obviously had its issues where it sort of there has been a conversation in organizations where, okay, what is right for me? In some cases, there is a blanket question of, okay, I want to use an API gateway, so give me which is the right one. In some cases, it is like, oh, we must use service mesh because we've been made to believe that is the right thing. And, you know, this XYZ company is using service mesh, and we should be adopting it as well because that's going to help us succeed. So from the context of a business who's entering the world of, you know, building out their API first products, and they want to take the next step of making things even more secure, more scalable, how do they start the discussion, or how do they start thinking about choosing the right solution? Is the question, once again, I think going back to the statements that was made previously, is the question that you need to have one of them definitely as a must for your solution? Is the question it's either or is the question maybe you can use both of them? So where do you sort of stand? This is I know this is going to be an opinionated part, so I'm going to start off with Sedky here, and then I'll move over to Ahmed there.
Yeah, so I'll start with the boring answer. It depends. So the right tool to use depends on your business goals. If you have people problems with your APIs, enabling discoverability, publishing API products, and all the stuff that APIM solves, then use that tool. If you have hundreds of microservices and your problem is observability across all of them, and then security, you're probably looking at a service mesh. So it's not black and white, but it's really obvious when you look at your business goals. The problem many people are making, many technology leaders are making, many API engineers are making, is they're putting technologies and fun technical problems that they want to solve ahead of business problems. So if everybody stopped and asked themselves, hey, do I really need this thing? I predict the amount of service mesh use cases would drop significantly because of the complexity that it introduces. Whereas an API gateway, it solves a much different problem. So with all of the companies that I've worked with, so right now, the latest stat that I remember reading is 96% of companies are looking at or evaluating Kubernetes. And so within all of that, a very small number are looking at service mesh. So why does service mesh exist? To solve real problems that large companies have. So Netflix, big proponents, they blog about service mesh all the time. They have thousands of microservices, and they have a real need to make sure that their services are online and operational, that they're being deployed in a manner that is going to suit their very high traffic and so on and so forth. Whereas a 150 person startup who has 15 microservices that may or may not be one monolith will not get a whole lot of value out of service mesh. So again, the easy answer is just look at your business goals and figure it out, and ask yourselves is what are my problems, and then look at the solution. So I know I've been talking a lot, just the 20-second of why you should use an API gateway, and any API gateway, not just Tyke for that matter. So why was an API gateway introduced? It was born as a solution to us as an industry growing from monoliths to microservices and realizing we need a central common feature set to do auth and rate limiting and so on and so forth. So for that reason, even if you start with a monolith, you start with a microservice as a new project, you should probably be using an API gateway. You can use an open source. There's plenty of options out there that allow you to refactor without breaking your API contract and increasing the developer velocity by using a common feature set instead of rolling your own auth and rate limiting and so on and analytics. So in my humble opinion, you should use an API gateway for all of your API projects. A service mesh adds true value when you need it, and that's never as early as you think it is.
Great. An interesting point there, I think, is around scale as well. I think scale of the problem, scale of organization, and scale of what you are willing to take on as well. Curious, Ahmet, on your sort of thoughts and opinions on this. When businesses are looking to adopt a solution, for instance, is there a blanket statement? I think Sedky probably looking at it is a big proponent of using an API gateway, but is there a little nuance there as well, where I think if you are once again just about getting started, do you still need an API gateway, would you say, at a very small scale, or would you start off with an API gateway as an integral part of your stack and then scale up from there as you go along and maybe introduce something like a service mesh further down the road? So question on scale.
Yeah, I do agree with the scale question, but the scale point. But from my personal perspective is, by the time the organization has decided to adopt Kubernetes, my assumption is that they have a big enough scale to warrant it. So they already have hundreds or thousands of microservices. They're adopting microservice architectures. They have multiple teams, 10, 15, 20 teams. Maybe they have multiple clusters that need to communicate amongst each other. So in that scenario, absolutely, it makes sense to be looking at something like a service mesh. But also the reality is the vast majority of organizations, whether they be enterprises, they're not all doing the same thing. They don't all have greenfield projects. There's definitely going to be brownfield. They're going to have things on the rack. They're going to have things not in Kubernetes. They're going to have services and all of these services need to communicate, right? So you can't have a service mesh as a one-size-fits-all solution. You still need the API gateway to almost like connect the clusters. So from my perspective, you use API gateways and API management to go almost like cross-cluster or even cross namespace, depending on on how you've modeled your problem. And then you have your service mesh in the scenario where you have something like Kubernetes with your microservices that need to be communicating with each other.
There's a very interesting thing there, which I think I've been thinking about for a while, where there is this notion of an ideal architecture or an ideal solution, where we used to read this, I think, way back in high school, where we used to have this concept of an ideal gas in chemistry, where a lot of the calculation, to simplify things, we always assume that things are in ideal state, which they weren't. Real gases work very, very differently in chemistry and added a whole lot of complexity. And I feel like the same thing applies here as well, where a lot of people, I think, they believe that their current infrastructure or the current architecture is either at an ideal level already, or that is what they aspire to, but they're probably not there yet. So when organizations are thinking about it, how important is their own technical maturity in terms of thinking about when to pick one or the other or both? Because I would imagine, like you mentioned, something like a service mesh comes into the picture once you already have certain things in place, like Kubernetes, for instance, or you're already in the you're using microservices already. And that's when you start thinking about this, not when that's probably a step 3 down the line, maybe 3 years down the line, you're already talking about service mesh before having already had the conversation of how monoliths are going to move into the world of microservices. So the importance of maybe the technical maturity of an organization and how that factors into this particular choice. Sedky.
Yeah, Ahmet nailed it. You shouldn't be using technologies you're not ready for. And I don't mean ready for from a technological level, because anybody can learn anything or hire the right expertise. I mean, from, again, business goals. If your business goals don't necessitate it, then why adopt the increased complexity? And the thing is I'm going to eat my own foot here. So when looking at new projects or new products that we're building, I know Kubernetes isn't the right place to start. However, that doesn't stop me from doing it because I'm at a point where the overhead is minimal just because of the experience that we have and the frameworks and all the starter templates and all that. But to your point, Budha, you don't need it early on. So if you look at a single a 4-core machine with 8 gigs of RAM, it can handle thousands of requests per second. You have another box, now you have 2, you have some redundancy, you have some failover, and there's a lot less complexity than with Kubernetes. You can SSH into the thing, you can download Git and whatever tools you need. So there's a lot less overhead, and you can do a lot with a little. So at that point, you ask yourselves, do you really need Kubernetes? The answer is probably not. Do I need a service mesh? Probably not. Do I need an API gateway? Well, there are some use cases. Yeah, maybe. Maybe I need some authentication now. Maybe I want to capture some analytics without writing that in my services. So, yeah, you nailed it, Budha. It's don't put your tech hat on until you know what your business goals are. And I'm going to keep saying that.
Absolutely, that's a typical consultant answer as well, isn't it? Like it depends. There's usually not a black and white answer to that question ever. But equally, I think that the maturity question is a very important thing, and a lot of times people sort of skip over that because I want to say way back. I don't want to say way back, but I think there was a huge upheaval around digital transformation in organization. It's still happening. I think there's still conversation around digital transformation. And a lot of times digital transformation meant different things for different people. Some people it was, okay, we want to be in with the times and we want to just use the latest technology out there because that's what everybody else is doing. And we don't want to be seen as the organization that has fallen behind, even if that's not necessarily adding the right business value to your organization, to your product. It's not going to give you that return on investment that you had originally thought about as well. So it's a very interesting sort of balancing act there. But equally, I think a thing to note there is also the adoption complexity with certain things. You mentioned for yourself, because you're experienced enough in this space, for you getting started with a technology with Kubernetes right now is probably not as big a challenge, but for the organizations that may not be the case. Now, of course, like you say, you can hire the right people to help you do that, but those people not always permanent, so you need to build for scale eventually. And then that comes down to, okay, adoption complexity of what new technology that you're introducing into your stack versus the return on investment that's going to give you from over a period of time. That may not be immediate, of course, but over a period of time, is that going to be valuable enough for you to consider? Curious on your thoughts on that as well, Ahmet, in terms of the adoption complexity of organizations when we are considering either API gateways or service mesh, any new technology for that matter, versus say a return on investment conversation there.
Right. Okay. So bear in mind, you're talking to the head of R&D at Tyke. So,
yeah, exactly. That's why I wanted to have your opinion on this, because you're probably the ones looking at it.
So from my perspective, if you don't play with things and break things, you don't learn. So you have to go and explore these technologies. You have to go, you have to go and understand a little bit about what problems Kubernetes might solve for you. Otherwise, how do you know you're making the right decision or not the right decision? So tinker with them, play with them, but ultimately, you need to know and be able to answer the question, what problem am I solving? So it's all very well tinkering and exploring the latest and greatest. Oh, I need a service mesh. Why? Because it does, automatic MTLS, it does automatic service discovery, it does, I don't know, kind of traffic chafing, shifting, and I can do all these cool things with policies and automate them with CRDs. And then you find your actual users are API product managers, and you give them a CRD to be able to configure it, and they're going to look at it. It's like, well, what do I do with this? So you need to consider the users of the system and ensure that I suppose you're solving the right kind of problems, using the right tools for the job.
Absolutely. And I think I've got a very interesting point around using the right tools for the job versus complexity. I'll come to that shortly, but there's a question from the audience. Thank you so much for the question. It's an anonymous attendee at this point, and it sort of touches upon something that you just mentioned, which was if an organization is looking to adopt something like mutual TLS end-to-end, that has certain challenges when it comes to an API gateway. For context, the API gateway that this person is using is the AWS API gateway. And there are certain challenges with adopting or using MTLS for that communication layer at this point. So the question there, as an oversimplification almost, is just wondering, how do people overcome this issue? And does service mesh make it easier? Does service mesh provide us an easier solution to this, given the constraints at the gateway level? So MTLS between services, service communication, is that a better way of handling it through service meshes? Can gateways do it? Maybe not, or yes or no?
I have no idea. I feel like I just read a sprint ticket for a developer who's looking to, you may as well ask ChatGPT, you might be able to get a better answer.
Yeah.
So not too sure. It's a great question. It's very specific, so it's hard to give an answer. Here's some things to think about. So if you're looking to do MTLS end-to-end, either you mean MTLS end-to-end between the client and your upstream directly. So you just need a transparent pass-through, which an ALB won't work. So you can look at using an NLB. But if you don't mind a few handoffs, then this is something that an API gateway does solve. So an API gateway being, like we said, north-south, the bouncer into your API ecosystem. You can have between the client and your API gateway and MTLS, you can manage all your client certificates in an API management platform, or you can store them in a Git opsy fashion as CRDs or whatever it is that you're using. It's whatever. And then between the gateway and your backend services, you can also do MTLS. So I don't know if that counts for you as breaking MTLS by doing a MTLS termination and then generating another session. But you can certainly achieve it with an API gateway with service mesh. I'm not too sure. I'm really not too sure. It seems like something that would be solvable by a service mesh, but your answer is probably just as good as mine here. There's too many gotchas for me to answer. I don't know if Ahmet has a better answer than that, or more to add rather.
I think the answer is you can do it both in API gateways and you can do it in service mesh. What the service mesh will do is perform MTLS end-to-end amongst the microservice internally within the microservice calls. But where you're using something like AWS API gateway, the question just disappeared on me when I was reading it. Sorry.
Oh, it's moved over to the answer tab.
Okay. So the challenge with something like AWS API gateway, from my understanding, maybe I'm wrong and I need to get up to date on this, is that it can't act as an ingress to your mesh. So whereas other gateways, you can effectively allow untrusted traffic into the gateway, and then the gateway will then say maybe like just TLS traffic or something like that, and then it will open up MTLS connection to the inside mesh gateways.
You're absolutely right. So the interesting bit here is, I think the interesting conversation around MTLS is that if you really look at service meshes, I think one of the key selling points there is that it's capable of handling MTLS in service-to-service environments. So if you look at a vanilla discussion or a blanket discussion around service mesh, you would probably see that being the right solution for your inter-service communication, making sure that MTLS is happening at that level. But based on what Ahmet is mentioning, we are talking end-to-end here, and I think there are solutions such as Tyke, of course. We've got solutions where you can have the best of both worlds here, where you could have an entry point with Tyke as the gateway, looking at one level of your conversation, and then moving forward into your inter-service communication level as well. You could potentially have a situation where you can have a gateway and a service mesh handling, two things at two different levels, and you should ideally then look at a solution that works cohesively together, a gateway that plays well with a service mesh. And that's what one of the conversations to be had when you're choosing a solution, having the level of flexibility where it's not just, okay, which API management platform or tool that you're using, but a platform that is flexible enough, perhaps, that will enable you to play nicely with the service mesh as well, if you wanted to. Ahmet, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well, because we kind of touched on it, but we didn't really talk about it so much. And this is about the allowing, enabling untrusted traffic to come into the cluster. So, and then we spoke about like business problems of API gateways and API management, but then we didn't actually elaborate on what that meant. So things like OAuth 2, OpenID Connect, JOT tokens, and being able to extract claims from those tokens, OAuth 2 introspection. So you can do all of those kind of things at the API management layer, and then pass those as headers into your underlying service within the mesh, which is not something that you would typically do with a service mesh as well.
And as a follow-up question, I think there is an interesting one, once again, touching upon security, is what we just discussed. Does that actually break the zero trust philosophy, which, depending on what you're reading, insists that as part of the API chain, you need to have something like TLS, MTLS. You need to consider them as a zero trust network, as opposed to, we've got one entry point. Once you're authenticated at that level, you're getting access to everything, which is probably not the case anymore. But does that break the zero trust philosophy in any way?
Yeah, I think so. It depends on whose zero trust philosophy you're reading, but a lot of people, would say, And this is some of the value that a service mesh does add. So for the uninitiated, a service mesh, one of a huge value add of a service mesh is it will automatically give you MTLS between your microservices. So it's instant security that you get out of the box just by installing it. And so imagine that you have an API request that comes in to a Twitter landing page. And so you make the browser, whatever it is, it's a mobile device, it's your internet, makes an API call to the backend services. At this point, you provide, let's say, your username and password, you've authenticated, you've said, okay, so I have access to get this data for my friend's landing page. And so now I'm inside the ecosystem, I hit the landing page service, microservice, and I make a call. Now, you got to imagine the landing page is one microservice. I've just made the north-south call. I've initiated from my browser. It has to go and make a bunch of backend services to fetch all the data, right? It has to go to the user service to get data about the user whose landing page I'm on. We have to go to the comments microservice. We have to go to the post service. We have to get the similar feed, the ad service, all this stuff. And we have to aggregate it. And so the question that Service Mesh answers is, does this user who made this initial call have access to do all of these other calls between microservices? And so this is where we get into the increased security bit. So I apologize if I didn't answer your question about zero trust philosophy. I've kind of segued a little bit, but now we're certainly in more service mesh territory. Zero trust philosophy is certainly more of a SecOps thing than it would be an API management thing, in my opinion. I don't know if Budha or Ahmet, you guys have another opinion.
Ahmet, differing opinion on this one, where does it break zero trust philosophy? And once again, I think the conversation can also go towards to what degree is the zero trust philosophy necessary in an organization. I think that seems to be the case based on security policies or security plans within organizations as well, to what degree you want to have all of that as part of your stack. That's once again, that's the ideal scenario where you want to have the highest level of security in place. But maybe start off with the question of whether it is breaking the zero trust philosophy and how do you approach it?
I think possibly yes. But that's what it's supposed to be doing, because obviously you're coming from an untrusted network call from outside your infrastructure, and then you're validating it before you open up that before you start that MTLS connection, once you've verified that the request is authentic and permitted to do what it's allowed to do. That said, and you'll see this in, say, open banking, for example, where even between banks making payment calls or something like that, where they're making those API payment information requests, etc. But then those API calls are protected using MTLS anyway. So the client certificates are automatically loaded in that ingress gateway or the API gateway before opening up, before then performing its own MTLS connection into the infrastructure, into your internal infrastructure.
So then would you say if ideally I want to, within an organization, I want to have a zero trust based security policy, or have that strategy in place, then the only way that you can do that reliably is going to be to have both the API gateway as well as service mesh. So for those who are curious, zero trust essentially means that within the network, nothing is considered secure by default. Everything is considered insecure. So if you've got a few different microservices hosted across different pods, for instance, for the lack of better word, and I'm going with the terminologies, you need to establish that trust at every step. There is no, just because it's been authenticated at single level, it does not automatically mean that you're going to be considered secure at other levels as well. So for instance, the correct case over here is that at the API gateway level, when you are establishing that security and trust, that is the north-south traffic. Once you're within the cluster, if you were to assume that you're already secure by default and you've got access to everything, that is not considered zero trust. Zero trust would say that before you have a conversation or before you establish connection across any of those services at the service level or at the north-south level, you need to ensure that you are who you say you are, or what you say you are, or you're establishing that level of trust and security at each step. So there is no security by default. There's no secure assumptions by default. So that's essentially what the crux of zero trust is. And that's why I think we are having a discussion where an API gateway at the north-south level does a degree of authentication, getting your API calls within your service layer, and within the service layer, then that sort of is offloaded over to the service mesh, which is establishing conversation communication across those different services. So for those who might be wondering, that's what we're talking about in terms of zero trust philosophy. Yep. All righty. I'm hoping that gives you a bit. Yeah, there's another question. Yes, I'm going to go into that. It's a very interesting performance question. So in terms of having these sort of API gateways and service mesh, which essentially what it looks like, it's an additional hop onto your system before you're getting the right request and getting the right responses. How do you consider performance cost versus the benefit of adding these components to your overall technical stack? The question is around if you've got any insights around the performance cost when you're introducing any additional infrastructure. It probably may not just be about gateways and service mesh, but in this case it is. So how do you sort of evaluate that for performance versus what return that you're getting you're getting out of it? Sedky.
Cool. Yeah, so I'll keep it short. I spend a lot of time talking about performance and benchmarks. We have all sorts of automated testing repos that we can use that will get triggered on pull requests. So a healthy pipeline would include not only running unit tests, but you could also bootstrap your bench testing framework as well. This helps with smoke testing, figuring out if there's errors, but also you should always have a good idea what your throughput is and how your code changes affect your throughput. So it's very important to be always testing. But the question is, it seems, is more about what insights do we have on performance of adding an additional layer. So the vendors that are writing API gateways and service meshes understand that by definition, we're adding at least one other hop. And so it's their job to make sure that they're writing software that's optimized for that, right? So Cloudflare wouldn't be in business if they introduce too much latency. And so any good API gateway, any good service mesh will have that. That's why they're usually written in languages like Golang or Rust, because performance is at the very top of the list of things that need to be optimized and important. So yeah,
exactly. And I think performance is very, very important because, like you said, ultimately we want to get our request responses as quickly as possible. And I think ultimately what's going under the hood is important for some, but I think for businesses, what's important is, you're not keeping people waiting. But at the same time, it's also important to understand and put performance in context as well. What degree of performance is going to be important for your organization, whether you're going to be fixated on, or whether, having 1 single microsecond of, benefit is going to make or break your system or solution. It may be the case when you're talking maybe high loads of transactional information. I think that's where you want to get your performances up and running very, very well and quickly, and making sure that you have a performant gateway. But equally, in some cases where there might be offsets, you might have to consider performance versus certain things. And I'm not saying there needs to be a sort of, a fight between performance versus capabilities, but in some cases it might come down to what is truly important for your business. Where we've had this discussion on our All About APIs podcast, where someone mentioned that the security of the application is much more important for their businesses as compared to performance, for instance. So they are happy to give away a couple of milliseconds of time in terms of hopping but making sure that every single transaction, every single thing is 100% secure, even if that needs to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting. And once again, I'm not saying you need to choose either or. There are solutions that are secure and performant at the same time, but it comes down to, once again, what is important for your business and which vertical you are, who you're speaking to, what kind of application that you're building. I think performance as a blanket statement is probably not it, but to Sedky's point, people who are building these solutions are aware, they know that this is a consideration, this is a concern, and therefore build performance solutions by design. There are performance testing. We do performance testing ourselves under different loads, and the results are available readily if you want to have a look at that. And I think other organizations should do that as well in case they are not doing it. But I think this is a concern that we are aware that people care about. Ahmet, anything to add there to the discussion of performance and performance cost?
I guess with API gateways, they're probably they're more general purpose, because a single gateway will likely be servicing more than one API. So your API gateway, depending on the vendor or the brand that you choose for your specific use case, will probably introduce between 1 millisecond and maybe 20 or 30 milliseconds of latency. So depending on which kind of gateway that you choose and what kind of operations it needs to perform. The thing with the service mesh is that because there's typically a single gateway, a single mesh gateway in front of each underlying service, that means that those individual mesh gateways can be tuned because they're only doing one thing. And so hopefully you would hope that the latency on those requests that's being introduced by that hop is going to be less, because they're performing literally one job, and we'd hope that it's doing that job relatively well. Obviously, inside a service mesh, you've got a whole bunch of gateways that are now going ingress and egress across each of the calls within the service within the microservice chain. So obviously, if you add up 1 millisecond, 1 millisecond, 1 millisecond, 1 millisecond across 10 different microservices, that's going to be adding up. But I think the vast majority of the latency which is added is likely to be from your business logic and your database calls and things like that.
Got it. All right. Thank you. There's one final question that I can see at this point. I feel like we only have time for one last question, which is, to what degree does or should the mesh or an API gateway perform web application firewall type functions? And once again, I think there are different levels at which we might be talking about here, but curious, to what degree are we talking from a web application firewall perspective? Specifically, where does a service mesh stand? Where does an API gateway stand? Ahmet, do you want to kick this off?
I personally don't believe WAF belongs anywhere near gateway, API gateway, or the service mesh. I believe that there are purpose-built WAF solutions, which the request can go to those purpose-built WAF solutions before they come to the gateway, or after, or maybe they can be invoked by the gateway. But I don't think that WAF functionality should happen inside the gateway. That's just me.
Sedky, any differing opinion, or do you agree with this?
Same. Yeah, there's every big cloud provider has one. That's very easy to it's a check mark to enable. So yeah, API gateways and service meshes don't need to waste their time building even more common feature sets. Yeah, I agree with Ahmet.
Yeah. And I agree with both of you there as well. But because there's an important part there, I think we touched upon this earlier in a discussion. We were having a discussion with Martin, who's our CEO, and James Higginbotham, who I'm sure needs no introduction, during the TIG extravaganza, where we were talking about the same thing around service mesh and some of the challenges. And I think one key theme that came out of that conversation was around complexity. So we talk a lot about the right tools for the right job, and as consultants, that's what we want to talk about all the time. So there are dedicated solutions to do specific things. And in this case, in today's discussion, we've seen that with Service Mesh doing very specific dedicated things at the service to service level, with the API gateway potentially doing things at the north-south traffic level, and going beyond the audience and things like that. But we talk about security, for instance, which can be offloaded to maybe an identity provider, for instance. We can talk about monitoring and analytics solution that perhaps could be offloaded to, say, a Datadog, for instance. And that's all well and good. We should be using the right tools for the right job. But equally, would you say that there is a challenge of complexity that it brings in? Because now, instead of having maybe a solution that's much smaller to manage, maintain, and make sure it's all taken care of, you are then looking at a few different solutions that you need to manage, need to handle, need to make sure that you've got the right people who know how to handle and manage them, making things secure. Your data privacy policies need to come in and need to all work cohesively. So just to get your final thoughts here in terms of, obviously, we ideally want to decomplexify things as much as possible. That is the ultimate objective. But equally, we talk a lot about the right tools for the right job. So where is that balance of using the right tools and expanding your stack with dedicated solutions versus having lower complexity to manage? Perhaps Sedky, I'll start off with you.
Sure, yeah. Again, business goals or tech requirements, but if I'll be more practical. So ideally in a perfect world, yeah. So when you need it, you use it. But let's be honest, some of the best explorations and POCs we've all done is on downtime, right? And perhaps that's a lot of inspiration for one engineer start looking at what's the next best thing that I could do to optimize. And then they start looking at things like service meshes and so on. So yeah, so that was my boring answer, is don't look at technologies until you have problems that you need to solve. But then again, like for example, for my teams, I like to have a budget of 10 to 20% downtime so they can use that time to explore and learn, and a whole bunch of good comes out of that. So yeah, I think I answered your question. I don't know, but
I'm talking more about the balance of them. We obviously want to explore and make sure that, the newer technologies, we want to know what's on the horizon. We want to make sure that when a business challenge comes to us, and I think we are not caught off guard where we are trying to scramble for a solution, but we have certain things in mind already when we reach that stage. But equally at the same time, I think trying to branch out to a lot of different things can add to the complexity of your stack as well. And I think that's where there might be, in some cases, there may not be a solution against that. You may have to do that because you're at that scale, you're at that level where you need to have dedicated solutions to handle different things. Perhaps the way to look at it might come down to the flexibility of the solutions that you're using, where tomorrow, if you had to change your stack, if you had to change that dedicated solution with something else, perhaps you will have that capability of swapping in and out with the solutions that you're using, as opposed to being way too tied down by an ecosystem that might look really, really great at this point of time, but eventually might have that challenge. And that's where it comes down to that complexity challenge, where right now the simpler solution might be to just go all into one specific ecosystem that is doing a whole lot of things. But in the long run, maybe that's going to be providing a bit of a challenge as you go along. So Ahmet, you've got your hand raised, perhaps closing thoughts on this particular topic.
Yeah, I guess from like at the point you're thinking of potentially adopting something like a service mesh, what you're trying to do is decentralize. Okay, so if you think about API management and API gateway patterns, you have process and policy, where it's very much a people problem, where we want to do this, then we want to do this, and we want to do this. But then when you start creating microservices and you're talking about decentralization, you're saying, right, you build it, you own it, you take care of what you're building, you're responsible for it. The thing is, the organization's going to have certain policies, and they're going to say, oh, right, we need to care about things like zero trust. But then how do you enforce that without being a blocker? And how do you stop those developers who are building these underlying services from making mistakes? How do you enforce that consistently? How do you stop them from building these cross-cutting concerns? And it's not just MTLS, we're talking about observability, we're talking about resiliency, and all of that kind of stuff which is cross-cutting concerns. How do we pull that out of the underlying services that they're building as well, so that they just don't have to think about it? And so you can almost like observe that centrally, but allow them to just get on with their business logic and solve the problems that they need to be working on.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. Ultimately, I think the question comes down to the final question of the day, which is, which one do you choose? Is the question from our discussion today, is the answer to that, once again, that consider your problems. What is your problem? What kind of issues is your business facing? And depending on that, you've now got the context of where Service Mesh operates, where an API gateway operates, what some of the overlaps are, what some of the differences are. So in terms of making that choice for your organization, for your product, it'll come down to what problem that you're solving. What does your business need? And always ask your question, am I making my own life harder? Am I going to be making life harder for my organization? And is it going to be worth it? Because that is ultimately the cost benefit analysis that you're having, where any new solution that you're adding, that's, once again, it's not a one-time thing. It's something that you need to manage, you need to maintain. It needs to evolve. There is security to be taken care of. And by no means are we discouraging any of that, but you need to be aware that there are going to be challenges with adoption, and that challenge needs to be offset by the benefits that it's going to be bringing into your overall solution. So any closing thoughts from both of you? We are sort of 5 minutes over, unfortunately. So thank you everyone who's stayed with us with these additional 5 minutes, but any final thoughts or nuggets for people to take away from today?
No, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks for having us. Hopefully we answered some of your questions about Service Mesh, or at least made you more confused. At least you got something out of it. So any other questions, you can reach me personally as SEDKY, Sedky@tyke.io, or on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to continue the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sedky. Ahmet, any closing words, words of wisdom for people who've joined us? No, just as we said, Key, if you want to get in touch, Ahmet, AHMET at tyke.io, and LinkedIn as well, and Twitter. I'm sure you'll find me. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been a fantastic discussion. And like Sedky mentioned, hopefully we've managed to answer some of your challenges, some of your questions, some of the hopefully making life less confusing, or maybe we added to the confusion. Tell us what you think. Do let us know. You have our email addresses now. I am Budha@tyke.io, and this is a single D, Budha, if you're confused there as well. Or reach out to us on LinkedIn, and we will continue this discussion. So if there's anything else that you would like to know from us, any specific question that you couldn't ask us today, then feel free to do so in the comments. This will be available on YouTube. This will be available. We'll be following up over email with the recording as soon as it's ready as well. So thank you so much once again. This has been a fantastic start to the year. Hopefully you're having a fantastic start to the year yourself, and I look forward to our next discussion, next conversation in a few weeks' time. So till then, take care. It's been a pleasure, and have a great day ahead. Bye-bye, folks.